Hey everybody, on my wife's computer. She finished work a little bit early. Well, she's still working, but she finished work with her computer a little bit early so I could try to get you a video lecture on time. And the one thing I noticed in everybody's posts was that everybody wanted more puppy time. And because I don't have as much time and my wife's computer is not as powerful as mine, I can't edit in slides or photos or other videos. So if you want to see my puppies, you have to see them in real time. So this is Paco. He's the one that the ranch is named after. He's a sweet boy. He's, I don't know, about 4. No, he's older than 4. I forget how old he is, but this is Paco. And this is Osa. Osa is our newest dog. They're all rescue dogs. She's a sweetie. I just gave her a haircut, as you can see. And she's the best hunter in the group. Reading this chapter about Waorani hunting and stuff made me think a lot about dogs. And I'm not a hunter myself. I've gone hunting with co-found people a number of times. But one of the things I would have edited into this video, I got some great footage of Osa chasing a possum and treeing it 2 days ago. So maybe in the future. But anyways, this is Osa. We named her that because for those who speak Spanish, Oso means bear. And she really looks like a polar bear, at least when she's got long hair. And this is Danny. Danny is our oldest dog. She's like 9 years old. She's a sweetheart. I love her so much. She was in intensive care last year because she ate a long, big, spiky stick and had sepsis and a burst intestine. But we spent a lot of money and got her saved. So anyways, this is the first dog. Now I'm going to open the doors so they can leave. Come on, guys, go out. Well, Paco left. He's a mama's boy. He likes to hang out with my wife. Anyways, so today I'm going to try to get this up right away, try to keep it short because I'm not quite sure how it's going to work on this other computer. I'm so frustrated that my computer is broken. That is a huge blow to my everyday routine, my productivity, and everything else. So bear with me. Hopefully we'll get it back Tuesday or Thursday of next week. And I'm not going to be as responsive to emails and stuff because I got to do it all on my phone and it's such a pain in the butt. And the Blackboard instructor app really sucks. It's really hard to use. Try to read your discussion posts. I could see a lot of them, but the way it's set up for Blackboard instructor is not good at all. So I'll try to get back to, regular performance as soon as possible. By the way, I've switched it up a little bit. Got a big light. It was really dark looking at me, so it's kind of hard to see the screen. But different part of my room. I'm back in San Antonio, and you can see all these piles of clothes usually. So now you just see a couple posters. Morrissey poster, big fan. So anyways, chapter 3, Victims and Warriors. It's about the transformation of Waorani gender relations. When I did look at Blackboard a few hours ago, I saw that a number of you had already posted on the discussion board, which is awesome. And the folks who did post, at least some of them, watched these 4 clips, which are very interesting. This, horrible BBC show called Tribal Wives is very, it's a clip about Waorani people. As I said, they're very famous, because they have this reputation of being the most violent people in the world, and there are still uncontacted groups of Waorani. So there's a lot of press, which means there's a lot of stuff on YouTube, which is awesome for a professor. So I wanted you to watch that because we're talking about gender and marriage and households. And then to give you a very different view of Waorani women with this contemporary women's organization. And there you see Waorani women wearing traditional dress, but speaking Spanish, being very educated, actively involved in political projects. The third video, La Chicha de Yuca Masticada, Maniac Bear Yuca. If you've never tried it, it's a big root crop. You can buy it in stores here, although it's expensive and it's waxed, so it's old. It's also in tapioca pudding or starch. It's one of the starchiest crops in the world. I think 97% of it by weight is starch. So not very nutritious, but it gets you tons of calories and keeps you going. And that, I believe, is a video of Napo Runa or Quechua people. Those are the people with whom the Waorani are marrying a lot now. And they are also the people that the Waorani fought a lot with in the past, and killed quite a few of them as Quechua people, Runa people, were moving into Waorani territory. Then that last clip, there's not much on YouTube from any of the First Blood or Rambo movies, but I wanted to show you one from the 2008 film, just to get a sense of, Hai's got this really interesting material in this chapter about violent cinematic imagery and how Waorani youth relate to it. I mean, people all over, I think probably, the quote-unquote developing world are watching these U.S. action movies, even things that, we consider very old and passé, you'll see on buses throughout Latin America. Van Damme, Jackie Chan, Sylvester Stallone. It's just everywhere. And what's interesting about Waorani men is that young Waorani men, they relate to these not just as some kind of like fantasy Hollywood, but they really relate to them in terms of their own history and their ancestrality, because they remind them of this idea of Durani Bai, like the old people, and the association of past Waorani generations and contemporary uncontacted Waorani groups like the Tarumainane, and their reputation for strength, for endurance, for physical prowess, and for potential violence. So when a young Waorani guy is watching a clip like that about Rambo, he's not just having, imagining playing online games or something like that, or fighting terrorism. He's thinking about his grandfather, his great-grandfather. And I thought, Hai was really wise to put that analysis in here. He's every time I've only taught this book once before, but I'm always just really impressed by this analysis. It's a very good kind of ethnography. He's not setting out to just talk about like what's new or different or change. This is just like everyday life. When you read some of the material that especially the symbolic economy of alterity folks. I know I keep slamming on them, but they're brilliant. But it's just looking at very traditional, abstract cultural logics. And the folks that Parecida Vilasa writes about, Viveros de Castro, they too are watching probably Rambo clips now. Why don't they write about this? It's not like it's disconnected from their culture. These people live in a globalized world. There's this assumption, popular assumption that, all these peoples were isolated and living alone, and then outsiders came and all of a sudden they're exposed to other cultures. What we actually know through Amazonian history, and we talked about this in the first weeks, is that before the Spanish and the Portuguese came and colonized South America, indigenous populations were much larger, and they were all related to each other through all sorts of cultural exchanges. So living with cultural difference and cultural diversity and being exposed to outsiders and outside ideas was always part of indigenous culture. I read a really interesting article that shows, like the contemporary moment, the kind of stuff that Hai writes about now maybe is more representative of like ancient Amazonian past than the past 400 years, where these groups shrunk down, moved into these little autonomous settlements. And especially folks like the Waorani seemed very isolated. Maybe that's not what they were like 600 years ago. And they were dealing with these kinds of forces of otherness like they are now. So anyways, interesting stuff. And that Chicha clip is just good because it shows, how you produce this bear. And Hai has really great material on how important it is to Waorani women, this idea of providing abundance for people in your community, bringing in outsiders, making the outsiders internal, creating large communities, creating life. And this is the main form of what Hai calls gendered agency, the kinds of capabilities, the powers to act that are associated with the different genders. And as far as I know, Waorani people only recognize 2 genders, although the gender, there is some specificity for each gender, but they're very complementary, very egalitarian, not a lot of hierarchy, domestic violence, or anything like that, which is great to see, of course. People think about all these old ancient cultures and patriarchy being universal. And it's refreshing, at least for me, to read about an indigenous culture that probably for many, many centuries has had very egalitarian gender relations. And for those who haven't taken a class like Introduction to Anthropology with me, we learn that what we know from contemporary foraging societies or recent foraging or hunter-gatherer societies Gender relations tend to be very egalitarian, and that form of living is probably closer to what we as a species lived in, that kind of social formation for 99% of our history. So you hear in contemporary culture all of this, men are from Mars, women are from Venus, men are always in control, they're the masters, violence against women is something inherent in human life. It's just not true. And if life is like that now, it's because we live in those situations that aren't, inevitable or natural. It's just the way culture and history and power is developed, and that also means it can be changed because it's not, something we can't change about ourselves as a species. So Hai reminds us of that fact. So you all had some interesting things to write in the discussion board, those who did write, and I know you had to participate without watching this video, but hopefully the PowerPoint went in, and you could look at that, and then you could also, just based on your own reading of the chapter, contribute to this. Something I wanted to say too, I really love the feedback I'm getting on the course from that extra credit discussion board. Keep contributing to that. Most of you have said the video lectures have been really helpful, which I'm super happy to hear. You recognize the effort I'm putting into it, which is I'm super happy to hear about. There's a minority of people, but significant people and really good students who say that it would help to have some kind of live sessions. So what I'm thinking about now is always doing a video lecture and leaving kind of the Skype office hours for Tuesdays, and then maybe on Thursdays doing a live group session during office hours. One of my colleagues asked him about that, and he's like, it sounds like a good idea as long as it's not mandatory. It won't be mandatory, and I will tape it or record it and then put it up on Blackboard for those who can't be there. He just thought maybe since not everybody be able to participate because of timing, connectivity issues, that it might give some students a slight advantage in the course. I don't really think that's a big deal. So we'll try that. It might not be next week if I don't get my computer back in time, but I'd like to try it in the future because, I love real-time chats. It's the one thing I really miss about this online format. So thank you for that feedback and that idea. I wasn't going to do that, but I listened to you all very seriously. So we're going to give it a try. I've only had 2 people, by the way, ask for Skype office hours. A little shout out to Stefania and Kristen. We had some great conversations a couple days ago. Folks, I've talked to one of you two many times, and the other first time, and we had a really great conversation. So if you want to, let me know, and we'll Skype, and it'll be interesting. I miss y'all. So anyways, really great stuff on the discussion board for this class so far, although only a few of you wrote. What was interesting, when I first put it up, I was expecting you to think of Waorani gender relations as very different from those in our society. But what I've seen so far is that they seem very similar. Both men and women being providers. I didn't know if you felt that way, but apparently a lot of you do. Women more associated with providing within the village or the household, domestic production, complementary gender roles, men being associated more with things like hunting. I don't think we've heard anything about Waorani women hunting. What's interesting in Kofan society is there are a minority, but some Kofan women who are the main hunters in their family and actually hunt big game with guns and stuff. And I write about that in my first book, which you can choose to write a paper on in this class. But because of all the menstrual prohibitions in Kofan society, for a large part of the month, women don't do domestic work. So who does it? Men. They have to cook, they have to clean. So they're familiar with all of a women's activities, typical activities, the complementary roles of a woman, and they have to do it. And in some families, men just aren't very good hunters. They're not interested. So women go out and get most of the meat with a machete and a pack of dogs, or they fish, or even some of them hunt with shotguns or rifles. We don't see that in Hai's book, but there might be cases of that he didn't write about. And you didn't say too much about how the YouTube clips really differentiated or made you think about Hai's account in any significant ways, and that's fine. It's just a question I thought I'd ask because I wanted you to watch these clips and think about them. They're fun clips, and you can watch them with your families. So gender and violence, this is the next slide. And I won't be able to put these in, like I said, but this corresponds exactly to what's up on Blackboard now with the PowerPoint I upload as a PDF. So as I'm going through this, you can look at that on the side. Gender and violence, as I said, there's very little domestic violence in Waorani society. Marriage is calm, it's usually stable, really amicable, friendly. gender relations. There are assumptions about what men and women do, their own forms of specific agency, but they're relatively loose and unstructured. Women participate in political meetings. They have a voice. They're not at all denigrated in Waorani society, which once again is really nice to see. And together, a man and a woman, keep a household going and produce abundance, produce food for it. Also, Waorani people have what we call a matrilocal or an uksora local post-marital residence strategy, which means that a husband typically moves in with the family of the wife. Not super common, but common enough. And that tends to go along with more egalitarian gender relations, right? That means the wife has all of her close consanguineal or blood relatives around her, and the man is maybe more distant from them. But on the whole, through providing food, especially Maniac Bear, women create kind of consanguineal or blood relations amongst everybody in their household, even in their village, even from other villages, by sharing substance. It's a very common Amazonian theme. The idea that you actually make other people into family members literally by sharing goods, food, bodily fluids with each other. You become consanguineal or blood relatives. So eventually a husband becomes, a blood relative to his wife. It's an interesting idea. Vilasa writes about that in her book, Strange Enemies. So we'll talk about, I've never taught that one before. These video lectures are going to be a bit rougher, but we'll see. I'm going to go over a lot of material for that book, as I said before, in a short amount of time, just so you can skim some stuff and we don't have to go over so much in such a short amount of time. What we also see, though, in Waorani society, men are obviously more associated with being predators. What was interesting to me is that, Hai says their souls are like kind of more loosely connected to their bodies, so they can be kind of overtaken by predatory souls or predatory or non-human spirits, almost in like an unwilled way, sometimes when they're angry. And this is a theme that I've been exploring in Kofan culture, and it's very much against this idea of generalized predation that came out of symbolic economy of alterity style analysis, that to be a human is to be a predator. And it's something you will and you choose and you intend as an Amazonian person. It's not the case for the Kofan. It's usually an unwilled experience of being captured that makes you a predator. And that is similar to the Waorani stance. Not only do you only kill in order to defend yourself, you kill in kind of an unwilled way when you're taken over by this outside force in a way that you'd never want. You'd rather live in a time where there's no violence. So this portrait goes against many of the Amazonian themes that other anthropologists have talked about. And, perhaps it's not a coincidence. As I mentioned before, Kofan and Waorani people live very close to each other. They fought in the past, but perhaps there were more relations there. There was a old story, I'm just remembering it now, that an old Kofan guy told me about one Kofan elder who would walk for dozens of miles, 100 miles to a river, and an old Waorani elder would walk from the other side of the river, and they became friends even though they didn't speak the same language, and they would trade goods. The Kofan guy, I think, would give the Waorani guy bows and arrows for hunting, and the Waorani guy would give the Kofan guy blowguns, and they had this very interesting relationship. Waorani people apparently call Kofan people the deer people. Don't know why. Nobody's written about it, but it's interesting. So there have been connections there. Men, too, were usually the targets of past violence. They were, as we've seen before, often whenever a Waorani man talks in the first person about killing, it's usually for defensive reasons or because the person they killed was a notorious killer themselves. And in that sense, it's kind of defensive, too. So men were these targets of killing, but women and children were sometimes killed too. In the next chapter, we'll read about these horrific acts of violence against the uncontacted groups, the Taromenane, one in which there was a massacre of 23 people, including women and children, and Waorani people were responsible for that. Very complicated, and there may have been outsiders involved in trying to get rid of these people because they were sparing loggers and keeping resource extraction from occurring. I don't know how I'm going to do this next chapter. We'll talk about it, and I have all these images of that you can find on the internet of people being killed by the Tauro Manane. Not sure I'll share those or not with you, so we'll see. And something I think folks have mentioned too, I remember seeing it in a discussion board response, the idea of, often a man is killed and then they capture the children and then raise them, and often the child that's captured becomes the bride of somebody in the killer's group. So what would it be like to marry a man, who either himself or his family members have killed your whole family? It's just this like bizarre form of cultural difference that none of us can imagine. But apparently these marriages end up going really well. Once this gets back to that theme of history and forgetting and memory and how that functions in Waorani society. And Vilasa writes about that too, so it'll be a theme we'll return to. The next slide, something that I mentioned, this idea of Durani Bai, a Waorani phrase that means like the ancient ones, like the old ones. This is very important for Waorani people. When it's in terms of masculinity, it's associated with autonomy, strength, and ability to kill that the older generations had, and the uncontacted or peoples living in voluntary isolation, the Waorani people living in voluntary isolation, still have. But it's also a phrase that refers to all sorts of traditional customs, objects, activities, traditional songs, dances, rituals. Hai writes about this form of whipping boys to make them better hunters. Kofan do the same thing. Usually you take a deer's legs and you hit the kids boys' back legs to make him a better hunter with deer's legs. And it's not really like an intense form of whipping, like coercive punishment or something. It's more of a ritual. I didn't even remember that. Then I was talking to Ugo one day. I'm just pointing because he lives right back there with me in the house right behind our house. And he's like, oh yeah, we do that too. And I'm like, oh, I forgot about that. Ugo, by the way, who have you met? Want to share this news. He was just awarded a graduate research fellowship from the National Science Foundation. That's the top award for beginning doctoral students in all scientific disciplines. So a huge achievement for Ugo. Comes with a nice fat stipend, a lot of money. And these are not many are given out, maybe like 20 across all anthropology students in all schools in the country. Probably Harvard didn't even get one, but UTSA and Ugo did. So super happy about that. Y'all met Ugo, smart, great guy. Hai also talks about in this chapter spear killing and its association with hunting peccaries, these wild pigs, javelinas that we have in Texas, but also white-lipped peccaries. The same kind of spears you use for killing people were used for killing these white-lipped peccaries. And these stories about hunting white-lipped peccaries is something that Waorani men love to talk about. Long narratives. Kofan people are the same way. Hunting stories, that's the favorite kind of story. So young Waorani men, most of them have never, killed a peccary, especially with a spear, because they have rifles now. So it's this idea, once again, of kind of romanticizing, looking back the fantasies of this Waorani pure masculinity. Hunting peccaries is a much more unambiguously like positive image than, actual spear killing of people, which is very complicated, right? You're not supposed to be proud of it or do it. You're usually a victim of it rather than a perpetrator. Whereas with peccaries, which are very social animals, very human-like for a lot of Amazonian peoples. I mentioned in an article, I don't know if I put it up here or not, it's one of the few animal species that Kofan people pluralize in the same way that they pluralize human collectivities, and Waorani people feel the same about peccaries. So a lot about peccary hunting in this chapter, which is really cool. And it's something we saw in a video clip, I think for the last chapter that I put up on a PowerPoint. So today, because, young Waorani men don't hunt as much, they don't engage in spear hunting, especially of peccaries, the older Waorani guys say, they're becoming kind of soft and weak. And this is a continuous refrain that you hear in all cultures about the young generations. So we'll see what happens, but it's definitely happening in Waorani society, and it's related to something else Hai talks about in this chapter, which is the contemporary crisis of masculinity in Waorani society. I told you he wrote about gender, and he does, and this chapter is a great example of it. So masculine fantasies, something I already talked about. For young Waorani men to be a man, to have strength and endurance and capacity potentially for violence, especially violence in hunting or defensive violence against humans. It's not something they think about only in relationship to their grandfathers or great-grandfathers. It's something they think about in relationship to all these contemporary action movies they watch over and over and over again. These folks, Van Damme and Bruce Lee, are like huge, cultural icons for the Waorani. Actually, one of Ugo's brothers, they call him Bruce Lee too. He looks kind of Asian. So Bruce Lee as a figure in Amazonian societies, it's all over the place, and this chapter really resonates with me. So yeah, I've already talked about this slide. Women's gendered agency, I've already also talked about that a little bit. Women aren't so interested in watching these violent movies or talking in some kind of valedictory, that's not a word, something like that way about past spear killing and strength in the same way that men do. They're much more interested and take much more pride in and place much more value on their ability to provide for members of their households, as well as unrelated people in these inter-village feasts. So yeah, the real provider, men provide abundance, but women in their own ways too in Waorani society. I think in many heavily hunting and gathering societies, what you see is women produce the great majority of the calories that people need to survive. And that's definitely the case for Waorani through the production of manioc beer. And that's something that people drink every day. It's not just for parties. It's really your main form of getting carbohydrates in Amazonian societies. Kofan people usually drink a drink made out of plantains or bananas, much less than manioc. But most other Amazonian peoples use manioc or yucca for their main form of carbohydrate consumption. As I mentioned before, by preparing all these different kinds of food, and especially manioc beer, women create the household and the community by creating and sharing these foodstuffs, these substances that actually make people into relatives and into a household and into a family, into a community. That's women's form of valued agency in Waorani society. Women think about the past times when they could do this and bring people together, and they're still able to do it today. There's not a crisis of femininity in Waorani society in the same way there is a crisis of masculinity. And I have this quote here from Hai, page 90. Whether through providing manioc beer and songs for outsiders or familiarizing in-marrying husbands into their natal households, women's agency is characterized by the ability to incorporate and transform exteriority into interiority and thus constitute the household group. So women are the ones who take all these forms of otherness and outsideness and domesticate it and bring it in and create the community and the household and the family. Really nice kind of vision. I think this is the last slide about this crisis of masculinity in Waorani society. The roles of men have changed much more than those of women in contemporary Waorani society. Hunting and spear killing obviously are not important for men in the same ways today that they were a few generations ago. Now, young Waorani men are expected to be students. They're expected to work for companies, maybe even oil companies or loggers, and they're expected to be political leaders and activists. Something Kofan women, outsiders have always asked Kofan women, like, why aren't you guys the leaders? Kofan women, tend to be very shy, mainly because of problems speaking Spanish. They feel like they've never had the same opportunities to learn Spanish as Kofan men. And there was this one interview with this Kofan woman. She got really angry. She's like, some Kukama, some Okuwari, as the Kofan would say, or Waorani, some outsider said, why don't you guys become leaders? And she's like, because your men don't allow us to learn Spanish. We try to speak Spanish to men, and then they try to, make us in their girlfriends or have sex with us. And then if we try to speak Spanish with women, they think we're going to learn it just to try to seduce their husbands. So we're pissed off. We don't have the same opportunities to learn Spanish. That's why we're not in positions of power and leadership with outsiders in the same way that Kofan men are. And for Waorani people too. Men are the main political activists and political leaders. Although now, I don't know, Hai doesn't write about it too much, but there's a few really powerful Waorani women who become huge spokespeople for Waorani society. There's one I know and I've met, and she's actually married to a gringo guy named Mitch Anderson, a good friend who started a big non-governmental organization called first Clearwater, now it's called Amazon Frontlines, and they were mainly funded with like $4 million from Leonardo DiCaprio. This guy's been hanging around in Amazonian Ecuador forever. Really good dude. And he ended up marrying a Waorani woman, having a Waorani child, and living in a Waorani community. The dude's in like awesome shape. He's like a hunter and everything, but also like a really smart guy and a novelist. I'm sure he'll write a book about himself sometimes. So anyways, his wife is a Waorani woman and is a very strong and impressive political activist. And I should share some footage with you. I know some clips have come out with her speaking, and she's really impressive. So men, because they have to get educations and be able to work for a wage, they're getting married much later than they used to, something we see in our own society. Because now to provide abundance for a community, for a household, it's not just about getting meat through hunting, something Waorani men could do before when they were relatively young. It's about providing outside commodities and providing money. And that's harder. It takes longer to do. And then when you actually are able to do that, let's say by becoming a political leader and you write grants or whatever, and you get goods for your community, often you're not successful because that's really hard to do. There's all sorts of challenges, educational and cultural. So then as a man who's trying to fight for your people, you're constantly critiqued by your people for not providing enough abundance. It's kind of a weird double bind. Just like Kofan people, Waorani people don't really trust sometimes their leaders because they aren't sufficiently providing abundance. Plus this whole leader-led in a very egalitarian society, having a formal leader, it's kind of a cultural contradiction. Or there's a cultural push against it, and Waorani people are seeing that. In order to get a job, to get educated, to become a political leader in relations with Kawadi or outsiders, Waorani men have to spend time in cities and have to learn how to relate and make allies and friends with Kawadi men. And there are all sorts of cultural difficulties with that too. Because Kawadi men, non-Waorani men, associate masculinity with gender hierarchy, national Ecuadorian society. There's a lot of machismo there. Socializing involves, excessive alcohol consumption, and all these tales of sexual escapades and sexual prowess. That's how male camaraderie is often formed in national Ecuadorian society. Of course, that's changing too. There's a lot of great men, Ecuadorian men, non-indigenous, who are feminists now, but traditionally this is what it's like. And that goes against everything in Waorani society, right? Gender relations are egalitarian. No alcohol. I mean, Maniac Bear is like very low alcohol. It's hard to get drunk on it. By the time you're drunk, you're like so full, you're like falling over. So like drinking hard liquor, Waorani men can't handle it well. So it's really hard for them to go in these outside spaces, to be political activists, and to be appreciated by outsiders as warriors. That's one of the few things, young Waorani men, even if they've never killed anybody or don't hunt peccaries, they can still go into a town. People know they're Waorani, i.e. savages, and they're automatically given this imagery of being a very powerful, strong, autonomous, traditional kind of warrior. And, obviously young Waorani men like that because it makes them feel tied to their past and feel valued. But then as part of performing that for outsiders, you have to deal with these kinds of sociality that are really hard. So young Waorani men are in a psychological bind. There's this crisis of, what it is to be a valued subject, a valued agent as a man. It's harder for them. It's getting harder and harder. But as I said before, for women, it isn't. And if anything, female gendered agency is becoming more common and more powerful because so much of it is creating these relationships with outsiders and turning them into insiders. And now in this time of civilización, or civilization, when there's not killing, when there's not fear, it's easier to bring in more outsiders, to have peace, to have intercommunity relationships, kinds of domains in action that are really dominated by women. So if anything, as I said before, women are in a better space culturally than Waorani men. Very interesting thing to see. And it's an idea we'll, return to through the rest of the book. So I've already talked enough for today. Now I got to try to upload this. We'll see how quickly that goes through YouTube. But once again, thanks for being here. And hopefully next week I'll return to the same style of video lectures I had before. And we'll also try that new kind of live chat. So anyways, we will talk to you soon. Bye-bye.